So this is the first video in a series of videos about transitioning from treatment table to function. So the aim is to try and provide easy steps to transition into AFS. A lot of the reasons we find this so hard is our initial training is all based around assessment and treatment on the table. So understanding how that correlates or doesn't correlate to how someone moves and their pain is key to understanding how we're going to apply the AFS method. So the basic differences between table and functional assessment. The position, so obviously on the table we're supine or prone. Generally with an assessment we're looking at movement assessment. We're looking at someone sitting or standing. It may well be lying down, in which case we have a bit more of a correlation between the two. But generally most people are going to have problems when they're upright. So that changes the position. This position will also change the motion. So in this video we're going to look at flexion. But flexion is very different when you're supine as opposed to sitting or standing. So this is the difference between passive and active. Obviously most of what we do on the table is passive, so we're feeling for joint restrictions, how the joint moves, pain, etc. When we're looking at someone actively, we're looking at how they move. So we're having to use muscles to move the joints into the position rather than us moving the joints. So that can give us two very different results. Obviously the other things, when we're standing up, we have to deal with gravity in a different way to lying down. Ground reaction force, if we're looking at a movement-based scenario. The muscle action will also be different. So the muscle action from supine is very different to the muscle action if you're standing just looking at pure hip flexion. Obviously range of movement as well. Passively we should have more range than active. And then if we're looking at functional movements, we're going to be looking at more multi-joint motions. So there's obviously lots of pros and cons to both, which is why utilising both methods of assessment is probably going to be the best way forwards. But we need to try and be as specific as we can. So if someone was reporting a problem when they're in a certain position, we need to assess that position to clearly understand what's going on. We can look at it in a passive sense, we can look at it in an active sense, but we need to try and correlate the two together, and a lot of the time these pieces of the puzzle don't always match. So if we go through a basic passive assessment, obviously someone will be doing this on the patient, but you're bringing the femur up and you're looking at hip flexion. So we may not think of this as functional, but sitting and going into hip flexion may be the function that the person is reporting. So it may be getting out of a car, so lifting the leg up and rotating out. In that case, this is a functional assessment. If someone says, oh, I get pain when I squat, right, this may not be a functional assessment. If someone gets problems when they're going up and down stairs, this may not be a go-to motion. But if someone is struggling to get out of a car, this is a perfect functional assessment for flexion in that motion. Also, we can do this standing. So again, we think of this as, maybe it's non-functional, but if we've got pain problems going upstairs, this is a perfect way of looking at hip flexion in that scenario. So there's nothing wrong with this. It doesn't always have to be, right, I'm going to assess it with a squat or a lunge. Those are perfectly good exercises to look at if that's where the patient is reporting problems. So if we're going to look at hip flexion in a squat scenario, there'll be a lot of debate about which is the best way to squat and how do we squat. Basically, all you're looking to do is go up and down. People will do it different ways, and that's fine. We're looking at this from a pain provocation sense, and also when the client is getting problems, how they move around that, how they deal with that. So I've placed my hands in this position just to demonstrate where you can place your hands to assess what the hip's doing. So placing one hand on the femur and one hand on the pelvis should give you an idea of what the hip is doing in a flex position, how much flexion's going on, where we're getting more of the motion from, which bone's rotating faster depending which one's the driver. So obviously then we've gone into a lunge as well. So we've got an anterior lunge. Again, we can place our hands, as the practitioner, we can place our hands onto the legs and we can see how do they deal with that scenario in terms of ground reaction force now. Does that change it? If we were seeing the same repeatable pattern of doesn't like flexion in supine, doesn't like it seated, doesn't like it squatting or lunging, we know we've got a problem with flexion. But it may well be a case of we look on the couch, right, I don't see a problem, but when they're moving there is a problem. So is the hip actually the problem, or is there something else that's causing that hip to look like it's blocked in a functional task? And then we've also got single leg squat. So another way of looking at hip flexion. Again, all of these motions, we have to look at what else is being brought into the picture. So hip flexion in this scenario, we've got a lot of ankle dorsiflexion. We've got a lot of knee flexion. How does the spine deal with these motions? These are all parts of the picture that we need to look at, with the emphasis being on hip flexion. But which other joints and muscles are helping out that hip flexion and which are not?